All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Beth Hall. I go by Coach Hall here on YouTube, and I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas. And I wanted to do just a quick Q&A for you guys to talk about some questions you might be having about the exam. So first of all, I apologize in advance about the lighting and everything like that, but I want to kind of get into some of these questions that several of you have been asking over on TikTok and also here on YouTube. So the first question that someone asked is, if I have limited time, which essay should I focus on? And the answer to this really depends on your strengths. So what I would do first is I would think about the different essays that you've written this school year. And is there one where you tend to score higher? If so, I would focus on making that one your priority because you want to make sure that you get the highest score possible for that essay. Now, if you're kind of equal across the board, then I would basically decide based on what the prompts are, because every once in a while, students get a really hard prompt. And if you know it's going to be a struggle, maybe focus on the other essays instead. Now, keep the rubric in mind, though, because you definitely want to have a defensible thesis. That's one point. And if you can at least develop one solid body paragraph, that could help you get 1 or 2 more points depending on what you write. So I wouldn't leave an essay blank, but if you want to spend more time on a certain essay, really play to your strengths and see which essay would be best for you. Another question I got was how to not be a perfectionist. So how do you kind of let things go and just write the best possible essay you can? And I think this is really hard for some students. I'll admit it was hard for me as a high school student too, because I would just kind of like stare at the page and I would want to write the perfect sentence. And instead, that kind of limited me. So remember that your readers cannot score it if there's no words on the page. So rather than focusing on like the perfect words or the perfect sentence, just start writing. It can really help to have an outline. I know some students don't like outlining because they're like, oh, well, this takes up too much time. But if you have an outline, this can help you go through your essay more quickly. And it also helps you kind of turn off that perfectionist nature. So just remember what the rubric says. Think of it more like a game. These essays are viewed as a rough draft. So you're trying to score as many points as possible. It's not about being perfect. All right, so if you guys are just joining in and you guys have any questions about the exam, go ahead and leave it in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them. Right now I'm going through some questions that people posted on YouTube and TikTok. So another question I got, and this one had a few likes over on TikTok, is how do I read through all the sources of the synthesis essay? So fun fact, you technically don't have to read through all of them. Now you're going to be given anywhere from like 6 to 8 sources. Usually it's 6 or 7. 1 or possibly 2 of those sources is going to be a visual text. So it doesn't really take much reading because it's like a picture or a graph, but you still have to know how to interpret it. So just kind of keep that in mind. I would recommend practicing like skimming the source a little bit. So there's a couple different ways to do this. You could read the first paragraph and then read the topic sentences of the rest of the paragraphs and then read the last paragraph. That way you get the gist of it. And you can decide from there, does it fit my argument? Is it worth my time or not? Also, if you start reading a source and you know you're not going to be able to use it because it doesn't make sense or it doesn't fit what you want to say, just stop reading. You don't have to read and annotate every single source on the exam. Now, you do need 3 sources. I personally actually recommend that students try to include 4, just as like a safety net. But if you know you're not going to use a synthesis source, then please just stop reading it and choose something else. If you're really good at speed reading, that can be another option as well. So that's kind of when you don't read every single word, but you're not reading for entertainment. You just read it to sort of get the gist of it. It does take practice, but don't feel like you have to read each source. Once you've read enough of the source to know how you'd use it or that you wouldn't use it, then usually it's okay to move on. But I would say practice this in advance. All right, we got a few questions about how to prepare. Now, I think I did a video about this a ways back, but let me give you guys some tips in general because I know students want to be prepared. If it were me, I would practice timed writes. I know that some teachers include this as part of their curriculum. Yes, this will be posted on the YouTube channel as far as I know. I think I have it set to do that, but thank you for asking. So if you have not done a lot of timed writes this year, I would say that's a great way to practice. The College Board has the prompts online. So I would stick with stuff that's pretty current. Personally, I try to stick with stuff from like maybe 2011 to 2019. I don't go way back into like the 90s because the exam has changed. So keep it with the current prompts. And even if you've already done the prompt in class, it can be a good idea to revisit it again. So one way to prepare is to practice a timed write. And you can even do what I call a double timed write, which is when you time yourself for like 80 to 85 minutes and you try to do 2 essays. Now, if you're doing the synthesis, add more time. But let's say you're trying to do rhetorical analysis and argument, maybe give yourself about 80 minutes, 85 minutes, and try to write 2 essays back to back. And do it in the format that you're taking the exam. So if you're going to be doing the digital exam, I would type it. If you're going to be doing the in-person exam, I would handwrite it, because handwriting for 80 plus minutes kind of hurts your hand, to be honest. So just kind of like practice that as well. So timed essays are a great way to practice. And then if you can compare those essays to student samples, that would be really helpful. If your teacher is willing to look at it, that could be helpful as well. Something else to do is a lot of kids want to prepare for question 3, the argument essay. And so something to do for that would be to just like start looking at podcasts and also TED Talks, other things to get sort of background knowledge. And a lot of kids are like, okay, but where do I start? A lot of the prompts have to do with like social change or progress. So maybe focus on 1 or 2 people you want to learn about, or that you've already learned about in a different class that you want to know more about, or focus on maybe like a movement or a war or just something kind of big. Start there. You're not expected to know something about everything, but you want to be an expert on a couple different topics and play to your strengths. I've had kids who were, shall we say, an expert in like softball, and they've written some great essays because they played to their strengths. So just kind of keep that in mind. Like, it's not always about sounding smart. You want to make sure that you are providing specific evidence. So that would be one way to prepare for Q3. All right, so I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat, so let's see if we can address those. Oh yeah, it's a good idea to practice taking it in a mask if you're in person. Yes, that's going to depend on like your state regulations. But yeah, if you're not used to sitting there writing an essay with a mask on, please practice that as well. That's a really good point. I didn't even think of that. And then strategies for the multiple choice portion if you're doing it digitally. Okay, so I'll admit, like, I feel so much more comfortable talking about essays as opposed to multiple choice. And of the multiple choice, I much prefer the writing questions as opposed to the reading questions. It's just more my strong suit. Remember, for the digital exam, they're not the same order as they are for the paper test, which I think is actually a positive, because for the paper test, it's like, here's your reading and then here's your writing. But on a paper test, you can go back and forth. So for the digital exam, you can't navigate back and forth, but they've kind of alternated between like reading and digital. The College Board has this info on their website. So as far as how to take that test effectively, really make sure that you're reading the question clearly, because sometimes students misread the question and that leads to an incorrect answer. And I would say that goes for digital and in person. Don't linger too long on any one question. I know it's really frustrating for the digital test that you can't go back. And so you got to remember, though, that the multiple choice is worth 45% of your composite score. And your composite is on a scale of 1 to 5. So since there are 45 questions, you can basically say like each question is 1 point each. So what I tell my students is like, don't sacrifice future points because you're spending too much time on one question. So try to use the process of elimination. Try to find the answer within the passage as best you can, depending on what the question's asking. Make an educated guess and move on. So roughly, I can't remember the exact math, but I'm sure someone can correct me here. But like roughly, you've got a little more than a minute per question, but that's not factoring in the fact that you have to read it. So you don't want to spend 5 minutes on one question. And as a student, for me, that was always a really hard concept because I wanted to get it right and then move on. But then if you do that, first of all, you're not going to know if it's right. But also, you could be sacrificing some of the questions later on. And if you know you're stronger at, like, let's say the writing questions as opposed to the reading questions, if you take a little extra time, then I could justify you spending a little bit more time on it. But if it's like, let's say a purpose question, it's like, what's the purpose of this paragraph? And you're like, I'm usually not good at these. Don't stay on that question for too long. So yeah, you can't go back on the digital exam. So if you answer question 1, let's say, and then you move on, you don't get to go back to it as far as what the College Board has said. So on the one hand, be sure you're clicking on the right thing before you move on. But on the other hand, don't get stuck on one question. And also mentally don't get stuck. Like, I've seen students kind of like visibly, like, I guess, like spiral. Like, you could tell they don't know the answer and they get really frustrated, and that you can tell that they're like speaking negatively to themselves in their mind. Like, don't allow yourself to beat yourself up. Just say, you know what, it's a hard question, and move on, because there's bound to be an easier question later. So don't get stuck beating yourself up over a question either. Since we can't go back on the questions, would you recommend, if we are not done with each essay in 40 minutes, to just move on? Okay, so this is for like the digital essays. In theory, yes. That's the one thing I hate about the digital test, and I understand why they're doing it, but I'm a big picture person. So when it comes to the paper test, I would want to see all the prompts, and I'd want to decide my order. And I don't really think you get that luxury for the digital test. I would say if you're on a roll and you're like, I know if I just gave myself 5 more minutes, it could improve my score, then I would consider staying on that question if you're able to. But if you think you've written enough where like 5 more minutes is not going to change your score, then I would say move on. Because remember, they do look at your drafts or your essays as a draft. So it is a rough draft. It's, you know, it's okay if there's imperfections, and you could still have an imperfect essay score a 4 or a 5. I've even seen essays that scored a 6 have like little typos and stuff. So don't worry about that. That was another question that somebody asked, I think over on TikTok, is like, how much time should I spend reviewing the essay, like editing, rereading? I don't know that a lot of students have time to do that. I actually took a mock exam with my students last year, and I barely had time to go back and reread anything. And at that point, I was so stressed out, and I'm a teacher. So I was like, I don't know how students do this. So I would say focus on getting the info on the page. Spend time planning your essay if you need to. I do think essays that have a plan tend to be better. And I know planning takes a little bit of your time, but I would say if you're going to go back and try to make adjustments to your essay, then focus on content. Please don't worry about spelling and grammar, because you can have mistakes and it'll still be fine. So focus on adding meaningful content, especially commentary. That's sort of the hardest part, regardless of the essay, is the commentary. So if you're going to go back and add anything, make sure it's commentary, or make sure you're clarifying. Like, if you realize that what you said was kind of unclear, that would be appropriate. But otherwise, really ask yourself, okay, do I have a thesis? How's my evidence and commentary? I wouldn't really worry about sophistication as much. I'm not saying it's not important, but most students don't earn that point. So really focus on the things you can control most easily. And that would be a thesis and your evidence and commentary. So just to kind of sum up, if you think you can spend a few extra minutes on the essay and it would genuinely help your score, especially if you know that's your strong essay, I would say go for it. But if you're like, it's going to be a 4 regardless, or 4 out of 6, move on, because you don't know what's coming, I guess, in theory. Say we finish the synthesis essay early, can we move on to the next? Okay, so I think this person's talking about in paper. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the digital test, because my students are taking the paper test. So if you're taking the paper test and you finish synthesis early, can you move on? Yes. I would maybe just make sure that you've said all you want to say, but yes, you can move on. I have kind of seen something with my own students this year, though, that sometimes they'll have like 10 minutes left and they want to move on to the next essay. 10 minutes scares me. And I've read their essays and I'm like, oh, but you could have said this or this if you had just spent more time on it. So it really kind of sort of depends on how much time we're talking. If we're talking 5 minutes and you're like, I'm done, I'm ready to move on, go for it. Because let's say you're about to do rhetorical analysis. You're going to need some time to read that passage. But if you're finishing an essay with like 10 plus minutes left of your 40, I would say chances are you probably haven't written enough. And that's just my opinion as a teacher from what I've seen. I'm sure there are exceptions, but yeah, if it's like 5 minutes early, that doesn't alarm me. It's when students finish like 10, 15 minutes early where I'm like, okay, I'm not so sure you did all you were supposed to do there. Okay, so I'm only doing the digital exam because this year was online school and we practice essays digitally. Yeah, there can be an advantage to that. Some students type more quickly than they can handwrite, so that could help as well. Our school has just been in person since August, so this year was actually like normal for us, but I know a lot of people had totally different circumstances. Tips on the writing multiple choice questions. I think I did a video about this somewhat recently. There's different types of questions. They're sort of similar to the SAT writing and language questions. So if you're looking for practice and you just don't have AP resources available to you, the SAT practice tests that it's called a question stem. It's when there's a question above the answer choices. So it'll say like, what's the most logical order of whatever? Those are the ones you want to focus on. So for instance, the transition questions. Like, is a transition word necessary? For that one, ask yourself, okay, what is the relationship between these sentences? Is it showing contrast? If so, then eliminate answers that deal with like similarity. Something else, and I don't know that this comes up on AP as much as I've seen it happen on like the SAT. If there's two answer choices that for the transition questions that mean the exact same thing, like conversely and however, they're both wrong because they're the exact same. So it's not the right answer. For questions where it's asking like, should a writer add or delete it? I would maybe go back and like read the paragraph and see like, okay, first of all, does it fit the main idea? And then ask yourself, like, should they add it? Yes or no? If you decide yes, before you look at the answer choices, ask yourself why. So let's say your reason is that it adds important details. Chances are, if you can figure this out before reading the answer choices, there's going to be an answer choice that matches, and then it's a lot easier. Whereas if you're trying to go through A to E, you can kind of convince yourself of wrong answers. But I do think I have a video on that has like more tips in it if you're interested. Let's see. So, okay. Somebody said that they lose their train of thought if they handwrite their essays. Yeah, I could see that too. Definitely practice in the method that you're going to use. So if you know you're handwriting your essays, practice that. If you know you're typing, practice that as well. My teacher really emphasizes getting the sophistication point. Should I shift my focus? I hate contradicting other teachers. So especially if I don't know the full story. I personally tell my students to pretty much ignore the sophistication point for most of the year. And then as we get closer to the exam, we talk about it. That's not to say that they can't earn it earlier, but I have a lot of students who are used to being perfectionists. They're like A students, they want a 100. And it really stresses them out not to get the sophistication point. But to me, the sophistication point is pretty rare. And I think you can write a good essay without earning that point. So for my students, it's a way to focus on quality writing and earning the points elsewhere because that's what they need. But other teachers' students might need different things. I would say you need at least a 3 out of 4 in evidence and commentary to earn the sophistication point. So we've seen samples where they had a thesis point, 3 out of 4 in evidence and commentary, and the sophistication. Those essays are actually really interesting to me because it's interesting to see why they didn't earn the 4th point. But I've also seen essays get like a 140. So they got a thesis, evidence and commentary full score, but not a sophistication point. I also find those essays interesting. So if you feel like you can earn the sophistication point, then definitely don't ignore it. But if you're like, I've never even gotten it all year, then maybe your focus would be better spent on evidence and commentary. I will say this though, I do lessons with my students every once in a while about adding sophistication. And even if I wouldn't give their essay the sophistication point, by trying to go for it, it does help their evidence and commentary. So I'm not saying that everybody should ignore it because I do think you can kind of take ideas that might help you earn sophistication. And even if it doesn't work, even if you don't really earn the point, it does lead to a better essay. So I think it really just depends on like the individual. For some students, it's too stressful. For other students, they absolutely want to know how to earn it. But I do think evidence and commentary is incredibly important to focus on as well. So I don't know if that's like the best answer for your question, but I think it kind of depends. But if you're looking to improve your essay, there's nothing wrong with reading an essay from the College Board that scored a 6 out of 6 and figuring out, okay, this is what this person did. And then here's why I earned that point. And then here's how I'm going to try to do that in the future. Because worst case scenario is you don't get it, but you at least maybe tried to write a better essay. How negatively would having one quote per paragraph affect your score? Okay, so there's not a definitive rule about this, but I believe students should try to layer their evidence and commentary. So remember, you don't have to always have a direct quote though. You can paraphrase. So if you're saying just having like one layer of evidence and commentary, that would potentially limit your score, because if you do that for every paragraph, you haven't really dug deeply enough. But I don't want to say it's automatically wrong or automatically going to hurt your score, because I'm sure there's exceptions. But I try to get my students to incorporate multiple layers of evidence and commentary. And if you're not really sure what I mean by that, I just uploaded a video last night, and it's about selecting evidence for rhetorical analysis. But in that video, I do like a sample paragraph toward the end, where if you watch the whole video, it shows you how to like select your evidence and outline it, that kind of stuff. And then I turn it into a paragraph. So if you're like, I can never figure out what evidence to choose or how to like write more, that video might help you. But yeah, I would say a couple of things to keep in mind. You want to have evidence and commentary. But you also, if you only have like one piece of evidence, it's just less convincing, in my opinion, most of the time. All right, so I think I've answered everything in the chat so far. If I haven't, feel free to repost it. But I'm going to go back to some of the questions from like TikTok and YouTube in case those help anybody else as well. So somebody wanted to know, how can I write a well-developed paragraph in 15 minutes? I have found that when students have a plan, like some kind of outline, it helps. And this can be like a really simple plan, but it prevents you from kind of like being off topic or having that like writer's block where you sort of like don't know what to say. So planning, I think, can really help. It just has a better line of reasoning, usually better direction. I would say don't sweat the small stuff if you're trying to get it in 15 minutes, because that suggests to me that this person's trying to do at least 2, if not 3 body paragraphs. So make sure you have a clear main idea of the paragraph, like what you're clearly trying to prove. Make sure that's connected to your thesis. Don't waste time trying to like rewrite stuff, whether it's like on paper, just crossing stuff out. I've seen kids cross out whole paragraphs before, and I'm sure there was a reason that they did, but I'm like, you just wasted so much time. And if you're typing it, I wouldn't automatically just delete stuff because, you know, it could have been useful. So I would say have a clear focus. I recommend this general order of things: topic sentence, evidence, commentary, concluding sentence. Now, can you adjust that? Yes. But I think that's sort of like if you have the idea of these are the parts I need to include, it can help you go more quickly as well. And also I think practice. If you're really stuck on this like 15-minute thing, it sounds like the student really wants to increase their pace, then practice with different types of prompts. Is there a certain amount of words you need per essay? No, it doesn't go by word count. Now I know digitally if you're typing it on a doc or something, you can see your word count. No, it's really, the rubric is more about your development and your analysis. So, I've seen essays where it was an intro and 3 body paragraphs, no conclusion. I've seen essays where it was like an intro, 2 body paragraphs and a conclusion. I've seen all kinds of stuff. So it's not about word count. just like the quality of analysis. In the same way that there's not a magical number of paragraphs either. Okay, so let's look at some more of these questions. Do I need a counterclaim and rebuttal? So this would apply to the argument essay and possibly synthesis. Technically, no. Though if you do include a well-developed counterclaim and rebuttal or concession and refutation, it could help you write a stronger essay, possibly work towards sophistication. So what I've seen most frequently out of students is they'll do like 2 body paragraphs to prove the main ideas in their thesis. And then if they have time, they'll do like a 3rd paragraph that's a counterclaim and rebuttal. And you want to make sure that it's actually meaningful. I've seen kids kind of put one in there for like the sake of putting it in there, and it didn't really matter. It just kind of like weakened the essay. It may or may not have impacted the score, but it was kind of like, it felt forced, I guess. So if you feel like it's meaningful, I would say go for it. In fact, like if you had to choose between a meaningful counterclaim and rebuttal versus a conclusion, and conclusions just aren't your strong suit, then I would say go for it. But also just kind of remember that it has to add value to your essay. Another question that I got a lot was, can we use I? So, or like first person pronouns. For rhetorical analysis, no. Please don't say things like we or us. You're not the audience. But if it's for like question 3, which is the argument essay for the paper test, I need to stop calling it question 3 for those of you that are doing it digitally. So for argument, you can use personal experience. I've seen some students do this quite well. And I do have a video about how to write about personal experience if you're curious. But yes, for argument, you can use personal experience. Just make sure it's relevant. Usually when you write about personal experience, you need to have some sort of like change, or like it needs to have been like a meaningful event. It needs to obviously connect to your thesis. Now for synthesis, it's less common that students do this, but I've seen it work. So it really depends on the topic. But if you are given a topic where you can somehow like connect it to your own personal life, yes. I've also had students ask, can you cite yourself as a source? No. It would be sort of like, in my opinion, just extra commentary, but like, no, the sources that you're given are the ones you're supposed to cite. You're not supposed to like add a source, and you yourself are not a source. But some of the prompts in years past have been more about like things that are more universal, like school or libraries. So for instance, like if you have experience with a public library, you could incorporate that if it would help the argument. Now, if we're talking like the wind farm prompt, unless you've seen one or live near one, you might not have personal experience with that, and that's okay. Do you think an argument essay with only 2 body paragraphs could still earn a 5 or 6? Yes, if they're well developed. The first thing that you're gonna have to double check is that you need specific evidence, because that's gonna help you get that 3 or 4 in row B. And then you need to double check how consistent your commentary is. So is it possible? Yes. I think if you look at some of the release samples from the College Board from 2019 and 2018 that have been rescored, I think it is possible to see that you can. Though I will say a lot of the ones that scored a 6 had 3 body paragraphs that were well developed, but that's not an automatic rule. So just kind of like keep that in mind. But like, could you still be successful with 2 well-developed body paragraphs? Yes. But I think the key is the development there. I don't know. I just know that a lot of students don't always have time for a 3rd body paragraph. And so just kind of do what suits you best. How should I manage my time for my synthesis essay? I keep spending too much time on it. Okay, so I guess my question would be, where are you losing time? Is it the reading or the writing? Because if it's the reading, then you don't have to read each source very closely. I'm not saying don't read them at all, but you don't need to like, you're not reading it to analyze it. You're just trying to get info. If it's the writing, I guess my question would be, do you plan in advance? Because sometimes that can really help. The synthesis essay is just, it's a lot more involved because of like what it takes. So figure out where you're losing time. That would be my best recommendation. Sorry, y'all, I just need to take a quick drink. All right, my apologies. So yeah, for the synthesis essay, like, I think also I've seen students really struggle with certain prompts and they're like, I just don't even have an opinion on this. For my students, it was the wind farm prompt. They were like, I really don't know what to consider with a wind farm. So in that case, like, don't stall, just make a thesis. Sometimes, like, we encourage students to try to come up with a position before they read the sources. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes you need to read the sources and figure out, okay, here's what I could best prove using these sources. So try to come up with a plan in advance. One thing that I tell my students to do sometimes is like figure out, okay, what is my thesis? What are my main ideas? And then which sources am I going to use to prove that? Because that'll hopefully help you from like flipping back and forth between sources. And that does sort of save time. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. Like, you don't want to be going back and rereading sources to try to find your evidence, and that could waste time. So be efficient as you read through the sources. Okay, so we had a couple questions about how to predict your composite score. Because this is the first time that we're seeing this version of the test in its entirety, I can't totally say exactly how it would break out. There's a lot of factors. But if you're looking for a 3 composite, my recommendation is about 55 to 60% on multiple choice with at least a 4 on your essays. Mathematically, that I believe would equate to a 3. Now, if you want a 4 or a 5, you're going to need to increase that multiple choice and also hopefully aim for a bit higher on the essays. So again, I've seen people come up with like formulas that they think are what the College Board might use. But I'm just hesitant until like we see this year's scores and get that any kind of info from the College Board. But if you're trying for like a 4, I would say aim for about 70% on multiple choice. And this is just like my opinion. Please don't take this as like it's an absolute. And then either 4s or 5s on the essays. Obviously, anytime you can earn more points, it's going to help you. But remember, these things are kind of like a range. And then for a 5, if I had to put numbers on it, maybe like 75% on multiple choice and like 5s or 6s on the essays. That would be my best guess. But again, like, we don't really know. We can sort of guess, but like we don't know for sure. Let's see. Yeah, there is this one website that I've seen that kind of predicts scores. But again, like, because they haven't offered this full test, it's just a prediction. And I know a lot of schools do mock exams. My school does as well. And we have this like formula that we use. But I'm going to be really honest. Like, I have seen kids do well on the mock and not get the same score on the exam, or vice versa. I've seen kids do poorly on the mock and then do really well on the exam. So I do think mocks are good practice to get used to like the stamina of the test and some of the pressure of the test. But like, I don't put like a ton of faith in the mock, meaning like, I don't want kids to get too comfortable and think, oh, I've got it in the bag, and then not try for the rest of the year. But I also don't want kids to think, oh, I failed it, I'm never going to get better. Because I've seen both things happen. And like, remember, there's a lot of variables you can't control on test day. Like, you don't get to choose the prompts that you're given, but knowing what they're looking for as far as the rubric can help. Okay, so there were a couple questions on TikTok about how to earn the sophistication point. I have some older videos on my channel. One's for rhetorical analysis and one's for synthesis that gives tips. But just in general, if it were me as a student and I was trying to figure out how to earn that, I would read the essays from the College Board that have scored a 6 out of 6 and then read the scoring commentary. They're in 2 separate documents, which is a little bit frustrating, but they're readily available on the College Board's website. So if you're a visual person, or if you like to have a model, read the essays that scored a 6 and then read or earn the sophistication point. You can get, 131, but see what earned it, and then read the College Board's commentary as to why, and then kind of figure out, okay, like, how can I adapt this to my style? So you're not copying, but like, you're trying to figure out, okay, almost like the rules of the game. Like, what do they mean when they say situate it in a broader context? Or what do they mean when they say vivid and descriptive writing style. Because I think if you don't see it, it's hard to even understand what they want if you just go by the rubric. So that could just be something. Is 3 a bad score? No. But I think it also depends on what your goals are. So if you are looking to get into like a really prestigious school like Ivy League or just something similar, they're probably not going to take a 3. They're looking for 4s or even 5s. If you are looking for like your average state school, they will likely accept a 3. I haven't seen a school, to the best of my knowledge, accept anything lower than a 3. So if you know where you intend to apply next year, I'm assuming you're a junior. If you type in like, either go to your college's website and type in AP scores, or just do a Google search for like whatever the name of the college is and AP scores. Usually there's a place on their website where they list all the possible AP exams that they accept, and they tell you what the score is that they want. And then they'll also tell you what credits it like tests you out of, so to speak. I'm a teacher in Arkansas. So for the U of A, which is our big state school, they really want a 4, but like a 4 in Lang counts for one thing and a 4 in Lit counts for something else. Whereas if you go to like a different school, like there's a school called UCA, they'll accept, I think a 4 in Lang will like count the same as like a 4 in Lit. So like my students who want to go to UCA, they're like, oh, if I get a 4, I'm good. But then my students who want to go to the U of A, they're like, oh, I have to decide, do I want to take Lit or not? So please look at like the colleges in your area that are on your radar, or if they're not in your area, but they're still on your radar, figure out what they're looking for. Also know that there's other ways to potentially get that credit as well. Depending on if you're looking to like in-state schools, some schools offer like a concurrent credit. Usually if you're going out of state, they won't accept like it's through like a community college. So they usually won't accept that. But there are other choices. It really just depends on the colleges and your situation. But like a 3, in my personal opinion, is not a bad score. I know for some people it is. Like I've seen kids be devastated to get a 3. But it still shows that you did well on the test, maybe just not as well as you expected. So, and I have students who like, they are super excited about a 3. Whereas I had other students who were like devastated with a 3. So I don't think a 3 is a bad score, but I do know that for some people, they perceive it that way. Can I still get a 5 or a 6 if I have 2 body paragraphs? Technically, yeah. It's not in the rubric that you can't. The key is the development of those body paragraphs. So I would say if you're not so sure, really look at the release samples if you can. But also like, I would say the important thing is to know the rubric too. So it depends on which essay you're talking about, but usually to get a 5, let's say it's the thesis and then the 4 points of evidence and commentary, you have to be very thorough consistently throughout your essay. So if you write 2 body paragraphs, but they're very developed and they're sort of consistent with that develop, like they're longer and you're really answering the question and digging deep, then I would say it's possible. But if it's 2 sort of like mediocre body paragraphs, then it's probably not likely that you'd get a 5. It depends on the quality. All right, so I think I'm caught up on the chat, but if you guys have more questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'm just gonna go through some of the ones I received on like TikTok and also on YouTube. So I did start a TikTok a couple months ago. If you guys are not following me over there, I do try to do videos on there too. Still not totally used to it, but it's kind of fun, I guess. I don't dance though. I told my students that was where I draw the line. I refuse to dance on TikTok. Nobody needs to see that. So one of the questions from TikTok was, how can I practice rhetorical analysis? So I think this goes for like all of the essays, but like the College Board does post the previous exams online. Now, I haven't really seen a whole lot from 2020 because there's reasons for that, but like 2019 and prior, they've got online. So if you are looking for an official prompt, I would say go for what the College Board puts out there. I try to use College Board resources as much as possible because they've done the work. They've said it's good quality. But you could technically practice rhetorical analysis with something that hasn't been used on an exam before too. So I would say look at those old prompts. And I think I said this earlier, but like I prefer relatively current prompts. So for rhetorical analysis, I usually give my students anything from like about 2013 to 2019. I might go all the way back to like 2011, depending on what that year was. But I don't go back earlier than that, just because like the exam has changed a little bit. So I try to keep it with like relatively current stuff. And also, in case anyone is curious, I am working on an ebook that I'm going to be releasing for rhetorical analysis. It should be out by the very beginning of May, and I'll have a link in the description if you guys are curious about that. But anyway, I'm trying to come up with some additional resources for students as well. And I did do several videos last year because the exam was rhetorical analysis. So if you want to see like, how do you work through an essay? How do you plan an essay? I do have some old content that deals with that. And I did have a request to do like a plan with me video for this year for rhetorical analysis. So I'd be happy to do that as well. I hope to do it within the next week or so. So another question was, how do you answer the extent to which prompts, which are question 3 argument essays. I did a video on this, but I think the best tip I could give students is like, realize that you want to avoid absolutes. So if the question asks you something about like the extent to which, then realize that you shouldn't say like always or never, because those are easier to debunk. So ask yourself, okay, in which situations is this appropriate or fair, whatever you're trying to come up with? And then when is it not? And kind of set parameters for yourself. Because the extent to which prompts for argument, they sound a whole lot harder than they are sometimes, but they're really just asking you to come up with like, in these cases, it's this, and in these cases, it's this kind of thing. So the extent to which that, like, let's say competition is healthy. Well, in these situations, it's healthy, but in these situations, it's not. And if you figure out that it's mostly healthy, then prove that point, and then maybe use the times when it's not healthy as like a counterclaim and rebuttal. So yeah, nothing to be afraid of when it says the extent to which. They're actually just trying to get you to realize that it's like a spectrum. Like there's not like one definitive answer, that you can actually make a claim that fits a variety of scenarios. All right. Any other questions? Are personal examples effective as pieces of evidence? Yes, if done correctly. So I know when I first started teaching, there was sort of this emphasis on like telling kids not to include personal experience. I believe that's changed. We've even seen essays from the College Board for argument where a student scored well and they had personal experience. So there's a couple things to consider. You need to make sure that it's relevant to the prompt, first of all. Second of all, you need to include a little bit of backstory so that it makes sense to someone who's reading it that doesn't know you. Because sometimes kids just kind of like jump right in, and then it leaves the reader very confused. At the same time, we don't need 7 sentences of backstory. So keep it concise, but help us understand the situation. But more importantly, help us understand why it matters. Like that's the commentary, like, so what, or why is it significant? So what you want to do is really make sure that if you're focusing on like personal growth, that the change is relevant. And hopefully it's like a lasting change. It's not just like a one-time scenario. So I'm thinking more specifically of, it's the exploring the unknown prompt. A student wrote, it's in a release sample. The student wrote about like a ropes course and said that like they were really scared initially, but then they finally went through with it. And then it turns out that they love this kind of thing, and it's like sparked an interest in it, and they've done it multiple times since. That would show more meaning than just like if they said, oh, I was scared and I did it anyway. But if they don't say like, hey, I've done it since, it's maybe not as impactful or meaningful. So really look at like the personal impact and make sure that that's clear. But I do think it's okay to write about personal experience. And then one question I get about that sometimes is like, can I write about something that happened to somebody else? So like, if it didn't happen to you, but it happened to like your parents and you still know about it, can you write about that? I would say yes, as long as like the same rules apply. as long as it fits the prompt. And as long as there's like a clear reason that you're writing about it, whether it's like a transformation, personal growth, social progress, I think it's fine. In fact, like some of the prompts, even like older prompts, they do say experience. They've kind of changed the wording of things more recently to keep it more consistent, but I do think you can use personal experience. I would just caution you not to only use personal experience if at all possible. I suppose that would really depend on the prompt, but like you want to maybe try to include in a different paragraph something like current events or historical or just something else. But yeah, personal experience can be very convincing, so don't discount it. Just make sure that you're doing it correctly. All right, so I think that's all the questions that I had either on YouTube or TikTok. I'll give you guys a second if you want to just type a couple more in the chat. I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'd be happy to do more of these later on. I didn't really post this one. It was sort of an impromptu one. So if you guys have additional questions, feel free to reach out by either commenting on a video or on like any form of my social media, and I'd be happy to answer it either like on there or in a video like this. But I want to make sure that I'm doing what I can to help you guys feel prepared. So are there any like final questions anyone has about the 2021 AP Lang exam? You should do a walkthrough synthesis. I want to. Here's the thing about synthesis. I know that there's, he's a friend of mine, sort of, Heimler's History. He does these for DBQs, and he has permission from the College Board to show their resources. I don't have the same permission. I don't not have permission, but like I tried to contact the College Board and ask, and I never got an answer. So I don't want to get in trouble. And in their copyright, it says that you're not supposed to reproduce it. And it's a gray area. So I want to, but I don't want to get in trouble for copyright. So since I don't have explicit permission, it's really hard to do the synthesis. And it's also really hard to do multiple choice because I don't want to get in trouble. Now, rhetorical analysis and argument are a lot easier because a lot of the rhetorical analysis stuff is in what we call the public domain. So if I can find a way to get permission to do a synthesis walkthrough, I absolutely would. But I appreciate the suggestion. I do want to do it. But if you're like ever curious as to why I don't do multiple choice or synthesis essays like on camera, that's why. I can talk about the prompts, but I can't, as of right now, I'm not comfortable showing the College Board sources because of copyright. So that's why. But I do have like one video. It's from like over a year ago, but it's like a walkthrough of like the wind farms one and coming up with a line of reasoning. So that might help people, but I don't show the sources on camera. All right. Well, if you guys have any further questions, feel free to reach out either on a YouTube video or over on TikTok. I'm on Coach Hall Writes there as well, and I'd be happy to try to help. But if there are no further questions, I'm going to close out this video, but thank you so much for joining me today.